The Philadelphia Church of God presents the Trumpet Daily.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Trumpet Daily. Today I'm speaking to you from our headquarters campus in Edmond, Oklahoma, in front of the incomparable Armstrong Auditorium. Now, as I think most of our viewers know, the church that sponsors this television program traces its roots back to Herbert W. Armstrong. Prior to his death in 1986, Mr. Armstrong was the world's leading televangelist of his day, and one of the most prominent religious figures of the 20th century, watched, read, and followed by millions of people worldwide. Regarding his 57-year ministry, President Ronald Reagan said, "Mr. Armstrong contributed to sharing the word of the Lord with his community and with people throughout the nation. You can take pride in his legacy," the president said to Mr. Armstrong's followers. We do take pride in that legacy. In fact, it serves as a model for what we do here in Edmond and around the world. But it hasn't been easy upholding that legacy. After Mr. Armstrong's death in 1986, the new administration changed all of his teachings, and many of us were kicked out of his church for holding fast to our beliefs. On December 7th, 1989, exactly 22 years ago today, the Philadelphia Church of God began with just 4 families here in Edmond. Over time, as God blessed our efforts to reach out to this world in the same way that Mr. Armstrong did, the work prospered and our headquarters operations multiplied. In 1997, we began to print Mr. Armstrong's books and booklets, since the Worldwide Church of God no longer wanted them. They then sued us for copyright infringement in a blatant effort to suppress those writings from the public. We fought a 6-year legal battle for the right to make that material freely available to anyone who wanted it. We've written extensively about this grueling 6-year lawsuit in Raising the Ruins, and we'll offer you a free copy of this book at the end of today's program. So make sure you jot down the phone number that we'll display. Now, in Raising the Ruins, we explain how we spent millions of dollars fighting in court, and then millions more to finally settle out of court in 2003. And all for the copyrights of 7 books, 11 booklets, and a 36-lesson Bible correspondence course, all of which we have since been giving away for free. We used every available resource to fight for Mr. Armstrong's works in order to preserve, defend, and distribute what we believe to be God's truth. Along the way, we've been building up the facilities on these grounds in support of God's end-time work. We purchased these 160 acres back in the summer of 2000, and as I stand here today, it's hard for me to believe that just 11 years ago, I was walking around this very spot, and there was nothing but open pasture land, a large pond, and a few clusters of trees. It didn't take long for these open fields to turn into a thriving campus, pulsating with energy and life, adorned with magnificent structures and beautiful landscaping. We opened the doors to our college on these grounds back in August of 2001. In his autobiography, Mr. Armstrong repeatedly said that the growth of the work directly paralleled the development of the college, and the same has been true with our work here in Edmond. After obtaining all of Mr. Armstrong's writings in 2003, we saw an immediate need for a multi-purpose facility where we could store the literature and also process the mail. And we also needed to update and expand our television studio for my father's weekly program, The Key of David. That structure, the Mail Processing Center, was completed in 2004, the same year that we began work on the $3.7 million Hall of Administration, which is located immediately to my left. In 2006, we finished construction on the Hall of Ad and moved all of our employees onto the new campus. That same year, we graduated our first crop of seniors here at the college and hired 9 of them full-time. The following year, in September 2007, my father announced that we were moving forward with this incredible structure that you see behind me, a magnificent performing arts center unlike any other in the world. Even today, in viewing what God has raised up already through a relatively small church of only 5,000 people worldwide, and with a modest annual income of about $15 million, the numbers still just don't add up. Yet the work keeps right on growing and prospering as more doors swing open for us to finish our commission. Now, if you would please go and get your Bible so that you can read along with me from the passages that we're about to study. Herbert W. Armstrong died with his mind on reaching the largest audience possible with a message of hope, a commission his successors were dead set against. They stopped the work and ruined everything that God had given Mr. Armstrong for that work. And then God raised it right back up. He began with a small, faith-filled ministry intent on delivering the exact same message that Mr. Armstrong did. A few people responded to that message and devoted their lives to support that work. Later, God amplified the message with many of the same tools that Mr. Armstrong had used so effectively: radio and television, magazines, booklets, and books. And when the fledgling work of the Philadelphia Church of God plateaued, God raised up a college to train additional personnel for service in the work. To make it possible for that work to have a worldwide impact, then God gave us all of Mr. Armstrong's literature, and now He's added this beautiful headquarters complex from which we proclaim His truth. Let's notice a few scriptures in the book of Zechariah and chapter 4. We'll begin in verse 8. It says, "Moreover, the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, The hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this house, his hand shall also finish it. And you shall know that the Lord of hosts has sent me unto you." That word house there has to do actually with an era of God's church, an era that Mr. Armstrong built up and also finished. But it wasn't him doing the work, as he so often said. He often would write the members of the church and say, look, I'm not responsible for this. In fact, you've all been brought into this by the same God who's behind me in order to help finish this work. Notice what was behind Mr. Armstrong. Verse 6, if you'll back up a few verses, it says, "Then he answered and spoke unto me, saying, This is the word of the Lord unto Zerubbabel, saying, Not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord of hosts." You see, it wasn't by human might or power. Mr. Armstrong built up that church, that work, that worldwide organization by the power of God's Spirit. God was behind him. God was working through him. And that's the way it's been with this work that I described to you there in the opening. God has been behind it. How could you explain such a small group of people doing such great works as we've been doing these past 22 years? God is the one. Verse 7, it says, "Who are you, O great mountain? Before Zerubbabel you shall become a plain, and he shall bring forth the headstone thereof with shoutings, crying, Grace, grace unto it." So all of these mountain-sized obstacles that were often in the way of Mr. Armstrong's work, God just moved them right out of the way. Now, that's not to say there weren't a number of times that he struggled, that he fought to bust through those obstacles, just like we did through that 6-year lawsuit. There have been many trials and tests and obstacles along the way. There always are. But Mr. Armstrong pushed through, and God then intervened to move them out of the way so that the work could continue moving forward. Verse 10 says, "For who has despised the day of small things? For they shall rejoice and shall see the plummet in the hand of Zerubbabel with those 7. They are the eyes of the Lord, which run to and fro through all the earth." Who has despised the day of small things? That's the way it began for Mr. Armstrong. It was a very, very small beginning. Notice what it says in the autobiography. This is Mr. Armstrong himself describing the work that God did through him. "When God works through humans, it must start the smallest, like the grain of mustard seed, the smallest of herbs, which grows to become the largest. God's works through humans must start the smallest, but they grow and grow and grow until they become the biggest." Now, the work that God raised up through Mr. Armstrong, as I said, started in the smallest possible way, but it kept on growing. It kept on moving forward. Now, there were a number of growing pains along the way. As I said, the college, for instance, when Mr. Armstrong bought the property for Ambassador College back in 1947, the individual that sold him the property had no intention of ever letting go of it. He was actually trying to swindle Mr. Armstrong to take his money and to keep the land in the end. And Mr. Armstrong had to fight to get the college to open up. And yet he pressed forward, and the college did open. And yet, even over the course of Ambassador College's existence, there were times, like in the 1950s, when he had to scale it back and reduce the course load and lower the number of students that were there. And there were times even in the 1970s when they had to make cutbacks all the way to the bone, and he ended up closing the college for a time, just a short time. But still, if you look at it over the course of its existence, there were difficulties, there were obstacles. Daily radio is another example. Mr. Armstrong started with that in 1942, and he was excited. In fact, he called it a stupendous open door for God's work. And he spent much of his time traveling to and fro from Oregon down to California to tape programs. And yet, after 6 weeks, he had to cancel that program and save it for another time. It wouldn't be actually for another 15, 16 years before he really got the daily program up and running again. He went on television in 1955, again with the same excitement and enthusiasm, to start with this new craze that was spreading all over the United States. And he wanted to be on TV, and he went in headlong and got on many stations, but then found again that radio at that time was more effective. And so it would be another 10, 12 years before Mr. Armstrong would then come back to television. Let's look at John chapter 15 to just see a principle here that's covered in the Gospels, straight from Jesus Christ, what has to be done at times in order to promote additional growth. John chapter 15, you can read the autobiography and see other struggles that he encountered with the Good News magazine, for instance. He had to cancel that for a time. The Plain Truth also had to be scaled back at times. So this is something that he went through. It's easy to just take a snapshot of the work back in 1985 and to see this beautiful publication, The Plain Truth, going out to 8 million subscribers, or The Good News to 1 million, or The World Tomorrow, over 350 television stations. But along the way, the journey was difficult. It was a struggle. It was a straight and narrow way, as Jesus said, and he had to push his way through with the help of God's people and with the help of God's Spirit to get the work done. John 15, here again, just remember the mustard seed beginning. It starts in the smallest of ways, but then it grows and it develops and becomes the very biggest in the end. John 15 here. And verse 1, Jesus says, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the husbandman." Jesus, you see, is the vine. He's the trunk of the tree that we hold to. He's the trunk that we fasten our arms around. And God is like the husbandman or the farmer who takes care of the orchard or the crops. And then, as this parable brings out, we are like those branches. We're all part of it so long as we're fastened to Jesus Christ and what Jesus Christ is doing. So long as we're connected to the mind of Jesus Christ, then God will bring forth growth and development. Notice, though, how he brings that about. Verse 2 says, "Every branch in me that bears not fruit, he takes away. So if the branch on the tree, he's talking about a pruning analogy here. If the branch is on the tree and it's not producing fruit, well, then what happens? What happens on the farm? The vine dresser comes along and lops it off for the sake of the tree, so that the tree can grow, so that the tree can expand, so that the tree can produce fruit. That's what happens. The rest of verse 2 reads, "And every branch that bears fruit, he purges it, that it may bring forth more fruit." Notice that. I mean, even the branches that are producing, even those that do bring forth fruit, he'll purge those. He'll even cut those back in order to promote more growth and development. God is always looking. You can read the rest of that parable. We don't have time to cover all of it. But he's always looking to produce more and more fruit. If the branch doesn't produce, he cuts it off. If the branch is producing, he prunes it back. And it's all for the sake of bringing forth more fruit from the tree. The whole process, you see, it's called pruning. That's what that word purge there means in the parable, to prune or to cut back so that there will be greater growth ahead. Verse 2, again, the last part says, "And every branch that bears fruit, he purges it, that it may bring forth more fruit." You see, all of the cuts, all of them are made so that the tree as a whole might grow and produce more. That's what pruning, as I said, does. It actually helps promote greater growth in the future if they're selective, if they're made at the right place at the right time. It promotes greater growth ahead. Now, if you look at, again, some of the growing pains that Mr. Armstrong in his work went through, those are well documented in the autobiography. And we too, in these last 22 years, have had our spurts of growth and development and so on. And as I say, you look at it from the 22 years on perspective, it's incredible. It's incredible to think about what's happened around here on this campus just since 2000, but the work even that happened before then, when we were down in a little complex in downtown Edmond, and to see how it's grown and how it's expanded all along the way. And yet there were times, I remember back in 2001 in particular, when we made a series of pretty significant cuts. We went off of television for an entire summer, in fact, just because we were right in the midst of this 6-year lawsuit. We had just purchased this land, and so we came through with all of these painful cuts to make. We canceled our summer youth camp for 2 summers. We postponed our ministerial conference. We put the newsstand distribution on hold. Several freezes and several cuts. And even here recently, in these past few weeks, we've had to make some very painful cuts. The greater work at large has necessitated that we do so, including, unfortunately, this very program, the Trumpet Daily. On December the 9th, just 2 days from now, we're going to be canceling this program, at least as it plays over the air, and that will be the end of it. And coincidentally enough, it'll be 7 months to the day that we started this show back in May 9th, earlier this year. And perhaps that's all that God wants for us to run as far as over-the-air broadcasting is concerned. We don't know. It's something, though, that we want you to be praying about. We're praying about it. But we're also excited knowing that what God is doing and what strategic cuts he makes is always, always for the work. It's always to bring about greater work down the road. That's what we can look forward to. Now, along the way, we've learned so many things about the changing technologies of television, and it really has opened our minds, just like it did for Mr. Armstrong when he got into radio at first, or then when he got into TV later in 1955, and we saw that massively expand. It was many years later, but he learned a lot along the way, and the way technology is changing today, we're certainly hoping that we can press ahead with a strong presence over the internet. And hopefully, if God sees fit, to see this program back on the air so that we can reach more people like you, so that we can spread the message of God's truth as far as it can possibly go. What does God want? Well, we'll see. But we know this. If strategic cuts are made, it's always to promote greater growth ahead. Now be praying, though. Be praying that God would open more doors, whether it's for this program or any other part of this work, that God would open more of the doors so that we could get this truth out to this dying world. Look at what's happening in this world. This world needs God's message like never before. It needs God's truth. It's the only hope, in fact, for this dying world. It's something for us all to be thinking about for sure. Notice Luke chapter 19 as you turn over there. I'll just read to you another excerpt from Mr. Armstrong's autobiography. He talked about what he was learning with daily broadcasting. He said, "I had learned by this experience the tremendous power and impact of daily broadcasting. Back in Eugene, after almost 4 months in Hollywood, our coworker list had grown to at least double. I mean, there were some fruits that were coming in, but he had to cancel it." He says, finally, "Although I was unable, because of lack of facilities, to continue the daily broadcasting at that time, it was most gratifying to be able to now make a big expansion in other directions." You see, there was a positive side to it, even to those cuts that had to have been painful, particularly when there were positive signs coming in, a lot of growth coming from it. And yet he saw how valuable the experience was and how it was going to lead to a lot of other growth. Luke 19, here in the parable, the disciples are coming to Christ thinking that Jesus was going to set up his kingdom right then and there. And then Jesus uttered this parable to set them straight on that. He said, "Look, I'm going to be going away, and I want for you to take these talents or to take these pounds and to occupy them, not just hold on to them." That's not what that word means. It means to use it, to use those talents, those pounds, until I get back, to do the work, in other words. Luke 19 and verse 14, it says, "But his citizens hated him and sent a message after him, saying, 'We will not have this man to reign over us.' And it came to pass that when he was returned, having received the kingdom, then he commanded these servants to be called unto him, to whom he had given the money, that he might know how much every man had gained by trading." See, he wanted to call them to give an account for how much they did with what they were given. God's going to call you before the judgment seat, just like he's going to call this work or the people helping to support this work, and want to know, how much did you pour your heart into it? How much did you give? How much did you support? How earnestly did you pray for it? He's going to want to know. We're all going to have to give an account, aren't we? Verse 16 says, "Then came the first, saying, 'Lord, your pound has gained 10 pounds. And he said unto him, Well, you good servant, because you have been faithful in a very little, have you authority over 10 cities. Now, Mr. Armstrong applied the principle of this parable to the work in general, the work that God had given him and those that were called in support of that work to help Mr. Armstrong. Notice what he said. This is from a letter that he wrote in 1967. He wrote, "We are very careful in our stewardship of God's money. We want to be able not only to give a good account before the world's largest banks, but also to Jesus Christ when he returns." He says, "So that he may say, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been honest and faithful. In a few things, have authority over bigger things.'" Well done. See, he wanted to apply the principle here of this parable and make sure that when he was called before the judgment seat, that he could give an account. And Christ could say to him, "Well done, you've done well." And so along the way, as I said, he had to make decisions in faith. It was a work of faith. It started in the smallest of ways, as I said, and then it grew and expanded and developed. And along the way, so did Mr. Armstrong's character. As he learned from all of those experiences, as he learned from all of the setbacks even, as he learned from the persecution and the trials and the tests that he faced, his character really did develop to become more and more like God's along the way. And so should ours. Let's conclude over in Matthew chapter 7, the Gospel of Matthew, and chapter 7. Again, this is teachings direct from the mouth of Jesus Christ. Notice what Jesus had to say here. Matthew 7 and verse 13, notice it says, "Enter you in at the strait gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and many there be which go in thereat." See, it's a difficult road, in other words. Straight is the gate and narrow is the way. But if you continue reading in the passage, notice verse 14 brings out the that same principle, or continues with the thought. It says, because straight is the gate, and narrow is the way, which leads unto life, and few there be that find it. Only a few find it, because only a few are willing to travel that road, the straight and narrow and difficult road to go. That's the way Mr. Armstrong went. He says in verse 15, beware of false prophets. And then notice verse 16, you shall know them by their fruits. He says, do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles? Even so, every good tree brings forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree brings forth evil fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. He concludes, every tree that brings not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. Wherefore, he concludes, by their fruits you shall know them. You see, you're going to know. There's going to be some pruning and cutting along the way, for sure. But the fruits, in the end, they'll be obvious. They'll be evident for all to see. It'll be open and plain, just like we saw back in 1985, just before Mr. Armstrong died. Notice what Mr. Armstrong wrote in his autobiography. He said, all this history in retrospect about the struggle to publish the plain truth will remind the reader once again that it has been a long, hard, and persevering upward struggle to bring God's work to its present position of worldwide activity, power, and influence. It was a long, difficult, persevering upward struggle to get the work done. That's always the way that it's been. That's been the story of the Philadelphia era of God's church. Starting from the smallest of seeds, but yet growing to become the largest of beautiful trees. That's the way it was with Mr. Armstrong's work, and that's the way it is for God's work today. It's the same path that we're on, but the exciting thing is you're going to be able to know where God is working based upon, as we just read there in Matthew 7, the fruits that tree produces. Now for the literature, remember, as I said earlier at the top of the show, write the number down on your screen and make sure that you call now. If you haven't gotten a copy of this book, we offer it to you freely. It's already been paid for. We'll pay for the shipping. We want for you to know the story about Mr. Armstrong's work, what happened after he died, and what's happening today. The end of this book is about what you see here on this campus, what I tried to describe for you in summary at the top of the program. Call now and ask for Raising the Ruins so that you can learn about God's work today. Now, on the website, go over to thetrumpetdaily.com, and with this program ending its run on TV in just 2 days from now, you're going to want to go to the Trumpet Daily regularly so that we can keep you informed there over the internet. But if you go to the Trumpet Daily today, we'll put together a collection of articles in PDF format from this special issue that we produced last year when the doors of this house behind me opened up. We'll collect some of those stories for you, put it together in a PDF so that you can relive some of that history as well. As always, we thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again next time.